which is different from ours. China's corporate battle between private sector and SOEs, which raged so fiercely here last year, will, in my opinion, disappear as they become similar and indistinguishable. Those who argue for one or the other are missing the key role of the market, the key role of the identity of the main shareholders and where the dividends flow to. And above all that, the role of the state will increasingly be felt, in my opinion, through regulation and taxation. So China in transition here means the blending of private sector and state-owned enterprises. And the torrid stories of share dealings in China, which you've all read about, as I have, whilst probably exposing some corruption, misses, in my opinion, that it shows that China is experimenting with how to place shareholdings in places that enable China's wider economic and corporate goals to be achieved. The way in which China places these shareholdings will have a lasting impact on the face of China. Innovation is the buzzword today, and it's important, but it replaces hedge funds and commodities and financial services. Innovation is a serious challenge for China, but China's history shows China has the talents and skills to innovate, and it will overcome weaknesses in its armory for innovation. Innovation will lose its glamour in 20 to 30 years as our progress takes temporary periods of major innovation. Japan showed it in the 70s and 80s in TVs, cars and radios, the USA recently for its media communications, but these sectors have lives and then the fad moves on. China is gearing up to be able to innovate effectively, but would be wise to not excessively invest in smartphones and Facebooks. The cloud will make a huge difference, but the leading value of innovation is short-lived, 5 to 10 years. You just have to look at what's happened to the Apple share price to see something of what I think. China is focused on innovation as well as any nation. Its plans for educating the people more deeply and widely are well thought through. China's biggest internal challenge is to develop the domestic investment and consumption effectively. The decision of the 17th Party Congress to accelerate change was, in my opinion, overambitious, and the wage rises that followed were too big, and together with revaluation of the renminbi, left the Chinese economy neither domestic nor low-cost export. But the good news is that they realized what was wrong, and the elders have put in an emergency standing committee, in my opinion, to redirect the economy and deal with corruption and planning issues. It is a tough call, and we should wish them all good luck and good fortune in the next 5 years, China's probably most challenging 5 years. China's biggest international challenge will come from the USA, their pushback, rebalancing, tilt, call it what you like. Some people think it's a game they can join in. Whether Japan, Philippines, or Vietnam get over-involved with the American agenda, as we in Britain have found from time to time, you can get left isolated. But what the USA really wants is to be recognized as the leader in the world, access to the Chinese domestic market, and the certainty of international management. China will have to do more than appear transparent globally. It will have to gradually allow access to its market by foreign corporations. China can protect its own corporations, build local capability, but it will not be able to develop if it continues to minimize foreign market share as a mere percentage. The reaction is obvious now, and China must innovate to solve this thorny problem of access to its markets. And I recognize, as many of you recognize, and many of the speakers today recognize, that 150 years of shame is not simply a label that China feels, it's an experience of something that teaches China to be very wary of allowing the foreigners too much access too quickly. But finding the balance on that issue will be a challenge for the next 5 years. Chinese global companies will need to globalize their shareholders seriously and their management and operations, or China will face a protectionist wall around the EU and the United States working with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. I think Xi Jinping recognizes that economic development is number one and that corruption and planning have to be addressed. I think he gets the role of the market and corporate structures. I think he gets the USA agenda and knows how to deal with it. I worry that slips occur, the unexpected can happen, but my sense is that China in transition is good for the world and provides real opportunities. But boy, the journey is not going to be easy, and Obama must show if he is a neocon part 2 or an enlightened world statesman. Let us hope he is pressing China for an outcome that's beneficial to us all. That Japan drops its sense of a moment to recover Asian leadership on behalf of the USA, and that India stays away from being embroiled, or we'll have a lot of problems. The USA has a potential to be a force for good or bad in China's transition. I am pretty confident about China's transition because I think it has a leadership which is experienced and wise. We'll see. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perry, for your most intriguing speech. Now, let's welcome our next speaker, Dr. Shen Jianguang, Chief Economist from Mizuho Securities. Let's welcome.
Thank the organizer, LSE, the Student Union, and the Economic Development Forum to invite me to be here. So I'm very honored to be here to join such a distinguished speak group and also the audience. Yesterday, when I came to the hotel close to this building, one LSE student introduced the building to me that this is the new LSE building, and where the Queen asked the economist, very famous question, why can you predict the financial crisis in this building? So when I was thinking about this issue, one question popped to my mind is there's always talk about Chinese crisis. And yesterday we have the dinner, and another distinguished speaker in the afternoon wrote a very famous book called The Coming Collapse of the Chinese Economy. So I think there's a lot of prediction about the coming collapse of China. Probably I was thinking that this may be the reason why the Chinese economy has not yet collapsed. Right? Because the Chinese leaders always think about this question, how to avoid a coming collapse of China. So they do everything to avoid that. While in the many Western countries, people haven't thought about that. Then suddenly the crisis came and the Queen asked. So I think that's probably the situation I'm thinking about. So what would be the next for the Chinese economic development next 5-10 years? So I think it's only 10 minutes, so I will just just present my quick thought. I think the three topics I want to talk. First is the leadership change. To me, that's the most important thing for the next 5 to 10 years, actually 10 years, to dictate Chinese development. So the leadership composition and what they think and how they manage the economy will be the most important thing. How China can avoid the coming collapse, or how to achieve the next stage of development. So the first issue is about leadership change. So I think the question I want to ask is the new leadership, how powerful they are. All right, if they want to do something, are they powerful enough to push for their agenda? Second question is, are they willing to do that? Are they intention, whether they be very radical reformers or very conservative, right? The third question is the implementation. So for the first question, I'm very hopeful because this leadership, the new leaders are definitely much more powerful, as I understand, than the previous leaders. First, Mr. Xi Jinping, we know that it's quite exceptional for a Chinese leader to be the leader at the same time also the military leader, right? We know 10 years ago, right, it's different case. 20 years ago, it's different case. But that's the first time that Mr. Xi, got all the positions at one time. So that's very promising. In a way, he's much more powerful in that sense. Secondly, is Mr. Xi and Mr. Li. We know that the design is for these two leaders to last for 10 years. Another 5 have to retire due to the age limit. So there is, again, a core leadership. And I think that's make a huge difference. When Jiang Zemin, we know the previous leaders was termed the core, right, among all the leadership. But the predecessor of Mr. Xi, Mr. Hu, didn't get this title. So I guess maybe, and then again, we probably will have the title for Mr. Xi and Mr. Li. So I think that's make huge difference. So that's my interpretation. You know, the new leadership, is in a much powerful position. The second thing is about intention. We know that all the leaders, what we heard, you know, every word is about to reform, to have to push, you know, in order to overcome the vast interest, even though it's very difficult. I think the leaders acknowledge that. And also, they also acknowledge that only reform can change China, can make China avoid the collapse, overcoming collapse. So I think the intention is very strong, all the words they're talking about. Then the last question, actually, I'm not very sure about implementation. How they're going to, you know, implement reform, and how fast, how difficult is it to overcome the vested interest. You know, that's our untested. So that we will see over the next 10 years. So that's why I think the key issue is that the leadership change has been accomplished. You know, I think it's in a much better shape than people feared or expected in the beginning. So I think that's very promising. So what we need to watch for this year, I think, the most important thing, certainly from NPC, the National People's Congress in March, we will see who will be the central bank governor, you know, who will be the Minister of Finance, who will be the head of NDRC, you know, all these most important ministerial level officials to lead China over the next 5 years. And then another key event is the November, actually, is the third plenary meeting of the party Congress, the leadership. We know that in 1979, Deng Xiaoping, you know, in this third plenary meeting, announced reform, open door policy. So I think this is the event that probably Mr. Xi will give his idea or agenda for the future development. The previous party, you know, Congress document is mainly the work of the combination of previous leaders. So I think that's the event I definitely will watch very closely. So that's a very interesting thing is about Chinese economic development and the leadership change. In the past 30 years, interestingly, China have three, you know, pyramid leaders. First 10 years, Deng Xiaoping. Second 10 years, around 10 years is Jiang Zemin, and then Hu Jintao. The 3 decades, you know, we see the economic cycle is also, it's very, consistent with the political cycle. You know, 10 years, normally the first half, you know, economic growth accelerated, and then followed by a deceleration in economic growth. So what will happen next 10 years, right? So we are in the beginning stage of this. And also in the past 30 years, even though the growth rate is on average, it's about 10% per year, but we also experience the higher growth period, like 15% year-on-year growth. And then the lowest is around 4% growth rate. So there is also different crises, like Asian financial crisis. Sometimes when we experience crisis, we see really radical reforms that prepare China for the future sustained growth. I think one very important example is 1997, Asian financial crisis. I remember that time the policymakers actually was having a very, very big challenge. All this state-owned enterprise reform, millions of people was laid off from state-owned enterprises. At that time, I remember that all the discussion, when I was working in the international organization, all the discussion about Chinese banking sector's, you know, bankruptcy, 50% non-performing loans. The situation far worse than probably we experienced in this global financial crisis. But they managed it through very fundamental difficult reform, like joint WTO, housing reform, urban housing reform. People underappreciate this radical policy change in '99, for example, overnight, all the rural urban residents actually was virtually given apartment by the state, pay a token fee. And a huge privatization program happened in China in 1999. And WTO membership. I remember, I participated in a book project in OECD. Actually, it's instructed by that time Premier Zhu Rongji and OECD joint work on how China can cope with WTO membership. Why? Because there is a fierce criticism, a condemnation sometimes on Mr. Zhu Rongji, on Chinese government to join WTO. A lot of people say, the government is selling China. The auto industry will collapse, financial industry will collapse, agricultural sector will collapse after joining WTO. But what we have seen is a tremendous success, right? Our FDI, Chinese integration into the global economy, and become the world workshop. And we see the 10 years very accelerated growth after this period. So by looking at the history, we think gives us some perspective. So if they really can do the right thing, the future is bright. Certainly it's a test. So then we see the next topic is what kind of challenge. I think probably I maybe omit this short-term issue, look at a little longer term issue. I think facing China, the biggest challenge in my view, globally, is the weakening external demand. After global crisis, China cannot export as before. 20 to 30% growth annually in the past decade will be gone. So that's the picture we are seeing. The Chinese export growth declined sharply. Trade surplus declined from 7% of GDP now to around 2 to 3% of GDP. And also the recent challenge, even more severe, this is export growth rate. So I think this is one fundamental change in the Chinese environment. So they cannot rely on export to lead the economy. So I have to rely on domestic demand. Second is domestic challenge, is the rising labor costs. Yeah, in a way, it's an inevitable process in the development stage. This is Lewis' turning point. I firmly believe that Lewis' turning point has occurred in China in 2007, around 2007. Before, China is always considered a cheap labor country. $100 a month, you can get unlimited supply of workers. Right? That's why China attracts huge amount of FDI to build up the workshop of the world. But that situation cannot sustain because wage from $100 a month now already to $400 to $500 a month. Yeah, I travel extensively around the world. And recently, I went to Singapore, Southeast Asian country, quite a lot. There, the wage is around $100. How China can compete with Vietnam, Philippines, it's increasingly hard. So that actually is the new environment China is facing. How to deal with it? I think that's the challenge, but also that's offered a lot of opportunities. First, I think Lewis' turning point. I look at history, look at Japan, Korea. Japan have Lewis' turning point around 69, Korea 80. Afterwards, you always see the consumption become the driving force of the economy. So as in China, because the rising wage will make people, richer, so they will expand more. Consumption will increase, and also in China, certainly, maybe it's a half bracing or it's a risk is the housing bubble. Housing price in the past 5 years tripled, huge wealth effect. Finally, it's the government transfer program. That is China's wealth expenditure, government expenditure on social, on education, on pension. You can see very steady increase. Last year, for the first time, Chinese government expenditure on education reached 4% of GDP, from only around 1% 5 years ago. The tremendous increase in government transfer incomes to the household. So that all this, I think, will contribute to the rising consumption as driving force of Chinese growth in the future. Of course, the rising wage also push up the value chain. This is value added in Chinese export products. You can see a very sharp increase. And so all this have some interesting consequences, results. This, for example, the first chart, we can see that this is the Chinese market share in all developed economies. Actually has declined already. I think it's interesting to see that around 2009, Chinese market share in all developed economy has peaked out and start to decline. I think Chinese products are increasingly replaced by competitors from ASEAN countries and Mexico. Now, this is the Chinese manufacturing product market share in the US, for example, is declining already quite sharply, while ASEAN and Mexico countries are making up this loss in share of China. But on the other hand, this is Chinese market share in developing country. You see it's rising sharply. And together with this rising share in developing country, this is the Chinese market share in machinery. The products mixture has shifted from labor-intensive products to machinery, electronics products. So you can see that in past decade, this is two examples. One is in Brazil market. Chinese machinery market share, export market share, increased from 2% to 16%. So that's, I think, the future for China is increasingly, China is exporting machinery, electronic products, and is moving the value chain. I think this experiencing the same process as Korea, probably later Japan, was experiencing in their early years of development. So I think this.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you turn off your phones or switch it to flight mode because of signal disruption? Thank you.
So I think this is the key. So there is a lot of promising potential for China to move into value chain and also to utilize the enriched human resources. The reason for that, for example, we are seeing the wage increase rapidly for migrant workers because 20 years ago, there was 20 to 30 million migrant workers coming to the city to find job every year. Now, this surplus labor already declined to only 7 to 8 million a year. The same time, 20 years ago, when I studied in China, there was only 500,000 university graduates a year. Today, it's 7 million university graduates a year. So that's the reason. Now, of course, there's a lot of challenge. The reason is this labor, the cheap labors become more expensive. So China have improved the human resource tremendously. Of course, the challenge now for the government leaders is not how to find jobs for these migrant workers, moving from countryside to city to find job. It's how to find job for millions of Chinese university graduates, which actually sometimes only get lower salary even than the migrant workers in many cities. So I think that's a new challenge for the government. Definitely will change their policy. For example, moving from manufacturing sector to the service sector, moving from labor-intensive, low-value-added sector to high-value-added sector. This is not the slogan. This is really the pressing issue facing the Chinese government that will force them to find a new model for growth. So finally, I think due to time limit, I just talk about the next, the big theme in China, the next 10 years, is urbanization. We know that Mr. Li Keqiang, all the time talk about urbanization strategy. Yeah, I think that's true. It's the driving force and the most important element in how China can stimulate domestic demand, how to move up value chain. And there's indeed a lot of potentials. Even today, China only have an urbanization rate of 50%, 51%. That's equivalent to Japan in the 50s, USA even earlier, Korea 80, Malaysia 1990. So when the economy is developing, this is a huge pressure for the government to accommodate millions of migrant workers into the city, to move to city, to become city. But in China, there's a special feature there. Urbanization in China does not mean, I feel, that how to move the farmers into cities. It is how to incorporate 200 to 300 million rural migrant workers that has already lived in cities. But these are considered second-class citizens in China because even they are working in cities, they don't have hukou, the household registration system. They cannot they cannot access to the city service. I think there has also been very miserable to millions of families that the migrant workers' families, that their kids cannot go to local schools, so they have to stay with their parents in the country, the grandparents in the countryside. You know the very tragic case that 5 kids was killed in the rubbish bin. These are all these type of kids that live far away from their parents. So I think the next stage is how to give these 200 to 300 million migrant workers in the city equal access to social service, to education for their kids, to have medical service, right? And to have a proper housing, because most of them are lived in dormitory these days. And I think that's require huge, resource transfer from the privileged class in China to this vast amount of people that are struggling. So, but also that offer potential huge demand. But in China these days, government actually worried it's not about the demand. Actually, most worried about oversupply of most sectors. Right? If you name it in China, what are the oversupply sector? There are a huge amount. We know the solar panel, we know the steel, shipbuilding. The capacity utilization is only 50% in many sectors. So there is vast supply there. But we do need to find the new demand areas that can satisfy all the supplies. I think that's the sector that I didn't identify. But that actually involves huge income transfers policies, not to those officials. There is how many government-owned cars are used for officials. There's 10 million, 20 million, this kind of estimation. All these resources need to be redirected to incorporate. So I think that's facing the next 10 years, the huge challenge, but also offered great opportunities. And finally, I think it's about the issues in government, new leaders' mind is always how to overcome the middle income trap, as I just discussed. In the past 30 years, China has been very successful, moving from a very low income country to a now middle level income country. Just like in 30 years ago, Chinese income level is probably 1/10 of Brazilian income level. Now, it's just a 1/2. Right? 10 years ago, before the Asian crisis, Thailand had 3 times income per capita than China, but today it's the same. So even sometimes look at the middle income trap. I found that probably there are 2 types of middle income trap. One is probably lower level, like Indonesia, Thailand experienced after Asian crisis. But also there are higher level income trap, like the Brazilian case, 20 years stagnation. But China had not reached that level. Yes. So I think already China overcome the lower level middle income trap pretty easily, But now next challenge is how to be a real developed economy, moving up the value chain. So I think I hope the new leadership will deliver, and then after 10 years we'll see how significant this period is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shen, for your most insightful speech. Now let's welcome our next speaker, Dr. Martin Jack, who's the author of the global bestseller, When China Rules the World, as well as visiting senior fellow at LSE Ideas. Let's welcome.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the China Development Society for inviting me. And secondly, I want to congratulate them on this formidable event. And I was very interested in the opening remarks at the beginning to see how the society has developed. And, you know, as someone who many, many moons ago was involved in student activity, I know how difficult that is. So I just wanted to express my appreciation of this. Well, 10 minutes is not so long. I'm glad you agree. So having said that, I immediately want to divert from my text and respond to something that Danny said. Because one of the things that struck me over the course of the last year, and of course it goes back much further, is the difficulty that Western countries have had in responding to the rise of China, and a view that generally tends to underappreciate it, or even at times denigrate it, and certainly always with the imminent expectation that something is going to go wrong. And I just want to register this thought for you. This conference is about China, but I want to say something about the West and the Western mentality. And it's germane not just to China, but to Westerners. And that is the West going to be able to come to terms with the rise of China, to understand it in its own terms, to recognize what it's like, what drives it, what China's going to be like. And I think that the reality at the moment is, broadly speaking, the West, including many of the experts, not all of course, but many of the experts, are sort of constantly being dragged kicking and screaming, if you like, by China's transformation, but always behind, always a sort of break, if you like. And this worries me a lot, not just for the perception of China by the West, but also about the future of the West. Can the West learn to live with a China which it recognizes and respects as an equal? Because that's what the situation is going to be. And if we constantly live in denial, then I worry about our own future, because it will actually become a very serious constraint on our ability to come to terms with a world where China is the new center, as Danny explained, and the West will find itself decentered and ultimately, if it's not careful, be marginalized. I mean, you know, looking at Hu Angang's projections in his latest book for 2030, he projects that the GDP, according to PPP, in 2030, China's share will be around 33%, which is what it was in 1820. And America's will be half that. And Europe's will be somewhat smaller than America's share. Now, that's only, 17, 18 years down the road. Of course, it may not happen exactly like that, but it is certainly a serious scenario to consider. Anyway, that's a distraction, provoked by you, Danny. Thank you very much. Well, what I want to start by saying is something that really struck me forcibly when I was at Tsinghua University in late 2011. And it was the sheer energy and momentum of the debate in China. You know, there is a view, especially in a city like London, that we are the center of argument debate because we are a democracy, and China is relatively inert. Actually, when I came back from Beijing, I thought exactly the opposite. I thought to myself, look, China is absolutely alive with argument, discussion, and conflict over the way forward. And I come back here, with all the trappings of democracy, and we are stuck. And the debate is about subjects which are constantly recycled. So there's more to it than just having the institutional framework of a Western-style democracy. Now, why has China reached this cusp, if you like, of a great debate? Well, I think there are two reasons. One, clearly, China's reached a point where all sorts of new possibilities for the people and for the country are opening up, and lots of decisions need to be taken about which way, where to go, and at what speed. And I think this is really important, because in a way, what these debates, one of the characteristics of these debates is how operationally relevant they are, that they do inform government, and that government, by and large in China, has, especially in the economic field, been extraordinarily competent. Whereas I would say in the Western context, often the political debate, or these debates that I've been talking about, there's a sort of disconnect, if you like, between the debate and what governments do. And this is, I think, an important difference between the political tradition in China and the political tradition in the West. And in this context, I would say China has an advantage over the Western tradition. And it's got something to do with meritocracy, it's got something to do with the Confucian tradition, and so on. So that's the first thing, that China is, is breaking through, if you like, into a new area where it's got to rethink its foreign policy. It's constantly been rethinking its economic policy, but the challenges are becoming greater and more holistic, if you like. And the second factor, I think, is that we're sort of breaking out of the limitations and constraints of the era of Deng Xiaoping. I mean, we should reflect on what the Deng Xiaoping era was. It was an extraordinary decision, brilliant decision, actually, in historical retrospect, that China could only advance by focusing, concentrating in an extremely pragmatic way on economic growth and the reduction of poverty. And everything else in some way or other had to be seen in that context and subordinated to it. Hence, foreign policy now was geared essentially to creating the most favourable environment for this process. And this was the period, if you like, of basic industrialization, basic industrial revolution, which for ordinary people the world over, who in countries which have gone through this process, has required requires exactly the same thing. Huge sacrifices, tremendously hard work, and a very narrow focus on the need to escape from poverty. But that era, that Deng era, culturally, economically, politically, and in terms of foreign policy, is progressively coming to an end. It's not going to stop, because that's not the nature of things, but it's gradually becoming less important and less relevant. Now, what does this tell us about where China's going to go and what the problems are? I think it provides the backdrop to the, if you like, the era, I assume, a decadal era of Xi Jinping and his leadership. How to understand how China's likely to evolve? Now, I just want to lay out three thoughts for you about three pressures, three factors, three forces that will shape this process. And it's always worth reminding ourselves about these important conceptual blocks, if you like, because they are all crucial. The first is the one that greatest attention is always paid to in this era, not least in the West, but to some extent also in China, but in the West most notably. And that is modernity, the process of modernization, the extremely rapid process of urbanization, rapid economic growth, transformation in living standards, desire for much greater consumer goods, better homes, better things in homes, cars, new cultural habits, particularly amongst young people, and so on. All of those things which are, we know, we're familiar with in some degree or other, are the baggage of modernity. And it is perhaps an over-focus, over-concentration on these things that tends to breed an attitude that modernity is the same everywhere. It comes in one form and only one form. And because of history, we think naturally that that is a Western form. But this is misconceived. This is not the case. Modernity exists within a cultural and historical context. It's not something which is free-floating, apart from a society and how that society has evolved. So my second point is, and the second shaper of China in this period, will be China's history and culture. It may be, in some senses, this actually becomes more important now. The reason? Because, in a way, there was something unusual about the Deng Xiaoping era, if you reflect on it. And that was the huge focus on pragmatism. That China, crossing the river by feeling for the stones, China had to do things one thing at a time. There was no room for China to start expressing itself in terms of its past and so on and so forth. Now, I think as we draw to the end of that era, then, and the absolutely classic example for me of this is Yang Shutong's book, Ancient Chinese Thought, Modern Chinese Power, which is how to conceive a future Chinese foreign policy. Where does Yang Shutong, it's a very interesting book, I think. Where does he look? He looks, to the great scholars and thinkers of the spring and autumn period and the Warring State period. And actually the conclusions you reach, I think, are very interesting. They do actually throw some light. And this is one of the characteristics of China, I think, which is really marked historically and remains very true. And that is possibly, arguably, more than any other country in the world, China history remains extraordinarily relevant to the Chinese, extraordinarily alive to the Chinese. No debate takes place virtually without some reference to this thinker or that thinker, not in the last few hundred years, but in 2,000 years ago. And this is very important to recognize. And so as China evolves, for example, take the future of Chinese education. What's it shaped by? Well, it's shaped by different forces in some respects to the experience of Western education. Why? If you take those figures from the PISA survey by the OECD published in December 2010, Shanghai top in all three categories for 15-year-olds, reading, science, and maths. How do you understand that? And all the Confucian-based societies were right near the top. How do you explain it? Well, it's got something to do with history. It's got something to do with the respect and importance attached to education within Chinese society, not simply now, but over 1,500 years, 2,000 years, a very long historical period. Likewise, if you want to understand behavior, social attitudes, forms of discipline within Chinese society, then you have to recognize that whereas the West is a guilt-based society as a result of the Christian tradition and so on, China is